Since we circle, I'm going to just ask one final question
Sure.
that popped in my head, and I think it'll sum everything up. You have visited the worst nuclear disaster sites in the world and have researched the worst that could go wrong. Are you a believer in nuclear power, or do you find it too dangerous for us to use?
So that's a question I have been asked because a lot of people will think that I'm anti-nuclear.
All right, today we are joined by Philip Grossman, and this is a really big honor. Philip Grossman is an award winning cinematographer, videographer, documentarian, television host. Did I miss any hats, Philip?
No, we adopt dogs as well, so we do a lot of yes, yes.
No, I grew up with a Great Pyrenees. His name was Encore.
Yeah.
I grew up on a ranch in Arizona where we raised goats.
Oh yeah.
And there was a huge problem with coyotes in that area. And we allowed the kids, baby goats are called kids, in this big old arena. It's where we used to train horses running around. So the kids were in there. And we had a Great Pyrenees, Encore, who we traded like a high dollar prize goat for this puppy. And Encore lived with them. And they're an amazing dog, especially he was to me a working dog, technically. And he would just lay out there. And I kid you not, no pun intended, the kids would just walk all over him. And he would just be like, kind of nudging, get off. However, word to the wise folks, if you do have a Great Pyrenees, it's very, very important. You must introduce every member of their flock, so to speak, or they will kill them.
Yes, yes, they are extremely protective, known as the gentle giants, but they're fantastic. And my wife and I have been volunteering with the Great Pyrenees Rescue of Atlanta here in Atlanta for almost 15 years now. We've had several. In fact, I became a meme about 8 years ago with
Mm.
our first Pyrenees. He climbed up in my lap, and my wife took a picture, and she posted it on Twitter, I think, or Instagram or something, and it got picked up. And it now shows up in all those listicles where it says, when you don't realize how big your pet has gotten, and it always says when you realize you may have adopted a polar bear. So if you ever see that, that's our boy Schultz and myself.
But you have made kind of a specialization in your videography, I guess I would put it, of Chernobyl. And I thought it was interesting. I was looking at an interview and you explained something about how you were very interested in filmmaking, showed the talent. People liked your skill. They were like, you got really, a lot of talent, but there's no cohesive body of work. Can you go into that?
Yeah, and that's always I've always been frustrated by that because I am a photographer, cinematographer. Been doing it since I was a little kid. As I mentioned, my mother's an artist, my father was a surgeon, and I'm the middle child, so I'm always pulled. And it was I just took pictures of things I liked, things that were interesting. They always tend to be very engineering oriented, science, technology. I'm an engineer by schooling, and when I started showing and wanted to have shows and sort of become more of a professional at it, and not necessarily love to make a living at it, but being a starving artist is always tough. I just kept getting this. Well, you don't have a cohesive body of work, everything that works together, and that sort of drove me to. And it all was sort of a long story of how I got involved with Chernobyl. I grew up near 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania. I remember it vividly. I was in the third grade, Mrs. Murray's class when it happened. I started studying nuclear power, nuclear engineering in college before I switched to civil because I was also Naval ROTC scholarship and didn't want to wind up in a giant metal tube underwater for 6 months at a time. Fast forward, to my 40th birthday or thereabouts, and was really starting to look at, okay, how do I get my photos out there and do this kind of stuff? And I had a boss who I really just was fantastic. His name was Bill Peer, and he was retiring, not much older than I am, but he made his 5-year plan and says, I'm going to go sail around the world. And I'm like, do I really want to do what I'm doing for the rest of my life? And fortunately, it was my girlfriend at the time, now my wife, Elizabeth Hanson, said, well, focus on your photography, you've been told you need a cohesive body of work. So figure that out. So I threw my engineering hat on, and why is Timothy Greenfield not as famous as, such and such other photographer? And it's because of what you take photos of. You're the first. I started thinking, what could I do? Europe, everybody's taking pictures. Europe, Mount Everest. Okay, Mount Everest, some people done that, and it just happened to be the 25th anniversary of Chernobyl. My parents, my dad's side of the family is from Ukraine originally. In fact, the last president prior to the current one, his last name was Grossman, so probably related. And it just all sort of aligned. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to try and go. I'm going to focus on this, thinking, okay, I'm going to do this one series of work. And at that time, this is 2010 timeframe, there were no tours to Chernobyl. It was really off limits. And so I started doing research, and I came across a gentleman, Eric Podnizinski, Arkadiusz Podnizinski, and he had been once or twice before. And I sent him a note, said, "Hey, I'm going to go on this public tour I saw listed." He's like, and he finally said, "There's really no public tours. When I go, I sometimes take professional photographers. Do you want to go?" And so I said, "Sure." So I sent him my work. He says, "Well, you're obviously a professional. Wire me $500." And you typically hear that, "Wire me $500." Luckily, it wasn't
But you
Western
contacted
Union.
him, so that
Yes,
helps.
yes, yes. And it was a bank in Poland. And I have friends here in the States who are from Poland. So they checked out, yes, it is a real bank in Poland. And so I went, and I thought it would be a once in a lifetime opportunity. It was amazing. 5 days the first time I went. Um, we managed to, we'll say, I guess we can use the word bribe my way into the control room of reactor number 4 at the time. Eric hadn't been there before either. And so we were able to do that, and came home and said, "Great, I've done it." And then he calls me up about 3 months later, goes, "I'm going back. Do you want to go?" I'm like, "Yes, but only if we go longer." And it just started from there. Really, people always ask, if you had to do it over again, how would you do it differently? And it would be, on my first trip, I would have done far more research than I
Can
did
we?
prior to going.
You've said that in multiple interviews, and that was something I actually noted that I wanted to push back on,
Hmm.
because I kind of wonder, and it might sound odd, but if you really step back and think about it, because you've done multiple trips, could that not have been a benefit? That you got to go there like me. Like if you popped me on a plane and you took me there and I just started to look around, the sense of wonder or fear or dread or whatever you might have felt, that initial exposure without the knowledge, there is something to that. Have you considered
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, oh, most definitely. And that's, hindsight's always 2020. And that's why I'm like, being the engineer, I would have liked to have gone here and gone there. One of the things that I just didn't take enough photos of at the time when I went the first time was so reactors 5 and 6 were under construction at the time. The reactor itself was in a reactor assembly building near reactors 5 and 6. And
Hmm.
my first trip that I went, it was still there. And I took like one photo, not even really realizing what it was, and then it was scrapped the
Hmm.
next year, so it wasn't there. So those kind of things, that's where I always go, if I knew more, I would have known what that was and would have really documented more. But you're right. I think there's this value to, and that's sort of how I went about doing the documentary, or eventually getting to the Discovery Channel, Science Channel. Uh, Documentaries by their very nature are biased, and that's not a bad thing. We're just human beings. Someone goes, "Hey, I want to do a documentary on X," and then you go and research and get the information that fits your view of it. I've always been of the mindset trying to say, okay, I'm gonna, as corny as it sounds, let the story find me. And that's what I initially did. And so there's a benefit, most definitely, to, okay, I not knowing that stuff really helped, because I wasn't, burdened by trying to run around and find all these things. It was more like absorb everything you're seeing. And it was a very, when I first got there, it was overcast in November timeframe, and you're like, oh my God, this is going to be horrible. It's rainy. It's over. But it so made the trip because of the feeling you get when you're there and you see these things. And I've been just about every season of the year, summer, winter, snowing, mosquito season in May, and
How many
each
times total?
14 now.
Wow.
Made 14 visits, with the last one being, I think it was November or December of 21, right before the war started. And I've tried to go back. In fact, I was talking with my wife, and I said, "Well, we're going to go." I usually will fly into Poland, to Warsaw, then meet my friend, and we drive
Mhm.
there. Um, and I said, "Well, we're going to go. We're just going to go to Lviv." it'll be safe. And then, of course, 2 days later, a rocket landed and killed two people. And my wife's like, "You're not going." No. So I've got to wait until the war is over. It's a bit safer before she'll let me go back.
That's fair. And it's funny. Have you heard of the individual Seth Lawless?
That name sounds familiar, but I don't know where I've heard it.
It's very interesting. But what you're doing there, it's kind of similar to what he's doing. He photographs a lot of abandoned places, and
Mhm.
he's kind of famous for doing abandoned malls all over the
Okay.
country, which is
Yeah. Okay.
a different outtake. And I was thinking about what you're doing that's so fascinating is taking that to like the next level, because you're photographing a place that I don't want to be in, but I'm absolutely fascinated and curious to look at it.
Yeah, and it's funny because when I started doing this, so again, my background's in engineering, and I love. In fact, I spent a large portion of my early career as a civil engineer doing what's called due diligence, property condition evaluations. And my job was to go into a mall, a hotel, a warehouse, something that one of my clients was buying, and my clients were mostly banks and insurance companies at the time, and sort of understand what was going on with the building. And sort of that investigative portion. And this just takes it to that next level, and I love that. And then I also like teaching. My wife always says I have a really a unique skill of being able to take very, very complex things and simplify them to explain them to the general population. So I found myself really enjoying doing that. And I teach at universities every once in a while. I just finished presenting to a bunch of sixth graders here in Georgia about Chernobyl. Then I find out that my nieces and nephew who are in a STEM program here in Georgia, they were studying Chernobyl. And my sister, they came home and my sister goes, "You do realize your uncle has been there?" They're like, "Oh yeah, we forgot about that." So I'm like, kids today, but it is, I like doing it. And really what at one point, you sort of, there's this tendency to, they call it disaster porn. And that's not really what I'm doing. I'm trying, and my goal initially was to sort of document the change over the almost 10 years or 12 years now that I've been traveling there. 14 years actually almost, of the change of nature being there, and then also helping people understand what happened there, because I think that's, in the West we don't really know about it, and most people don't know about 3 Mile Island, let alone Chernobyl.
That
And
was one of my
you know
questions. Is
yeah.
because obviously 3 Mile Island, you said, was an influence on your life, and I think Manny also, Manny Grossman, your cousin who does Son of Sam. I've talked to him a lot. Um, I think he said he was influenced by it, or both of you were influenced by that. First off, I guess I'll just ask, what happened at Chernobyl?
Right. Okay. So Chernobyl, and it's there's a lot of things that caused the accident. There isn't any one, hey, Bob did it, or payoff and graft, or some big conspiracy. It's a bunch of things. So in general, the reactor was a flawed design. It literally is it's called the RMBK 1000, 1000 meaning 1000 megawatts of electrical power.
What
It
is that
was,
equivalent to?
let's see, so 3 Mile Island was two reactors, each about 1,000 megawatts, and that powered Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and actually powered south of Pennsylvania. But it's, 250,000, 300,000, 500,000 people that can supply power to. And and everybody always measures it in houses, but the largest consumer of power in the US is actually industrial power. Smelting of steel, manufacturing, that takes a lot of power. So,
And now
um,
AI, but we'll get into that
yeah.
later.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. That's an interesting one for sure. So it was actually a scaled up version, and there is a little bit of um, consternation around this. I've talked to people, and my research has shown that it effectively was a military based reactor, which was small, and they scaled it up to do general power.
Mm.
Now, there's a couple questions about why. So the reason that the military had a reactor, and the reason the design is the way it is one of the byproducts of the fission process is plutonium, and you need plutonium for bombs. Well, in a lot of cases, you have to shut down a reactor to pull all the stuff out of it, take the fuel rods out, and then process it to get the plutonium out. Well, this particular design it was individual fuel rods, or fuel assemblies. And in Chernobyl, there's 1,661 of them. They never had to shut down a reactor. Typically, a reactor will run about 18 to 24 months, and then you've got to shut it down and replace all the fuel. The
Hmm.
funny thing is, you only burn about 5% of the entire fuel in a reactor.
Hmm.
And it's because there's a thing called reactor poisoning. Basically, all the byproducts, the actinides, the things that come off of when you're separating atoms, start to absorb the neutrons. There are neutron absorbers, and effectively the reactor becomes less and less efficient. So in Europe, actually,
So is it
they'll
almost like getting dirty?
effectively, it's like having a lot of dirt, xenon, and a bunch of other components that absorb the neutrons so that they cannot be used for splitting of the atom. In the West, or in Europe, they reprocess their fuel. So they'll take the fuel out, they'll reprocess it, add the 5% that was burned off, and put it back in. That's why in France, which is like 70 to 75% of their power comes from nuclear, all their nuclear waste fits in a small warehouse. In the United States in 1970, I think it was 79, Jimmy Carter was still in power, or still president. They outlawed reprocessing of fuel in the United States. It's sort of like hey, we're not going to outlaw guns, but we'll outlaw bullets to solve the problem. So, with 3 Mile Island happening, they outlawed reprocessing of fuel. So anyhow, so in the Chernobyl plant, they had a robot, and you could actually pull the fuel assemblies out while the rest of the reactor ran. And so they would pull them out, they move them around, because the other thing is that reactor is immense. US reactors are maybe 15 feet wide. Um, this reactor is 45 feet wide because of its scale to do what it needed to do. And also because of that, it had no secondary containment. So in the US, we have a really thick steel housing around the reactor, and then there's a concrete housing around that, and then the building, so that if we ever had an explosion, it stays contained. Chernobyl, there was no secondary containment on that reactor. There was an what they call the upper level or upper biological shield, which is very heavy, but there was no secondary containment in that reactor. So you have sort of this design that's scaled, and things don't always scale perfectly linearly, and this was one of those. Then it was poor construction techniques. Soviet Union, in the early 70s to late 70s when this was built, centralized planning. So you have the government. The whole thing is eventually I want to make it to the Politburo. I want to be at the high level because everybody else is the same. These guys are above. There isn't a scale like in the U.S. And so you want to impress your bosses. So if they say, "Hey, we want it done in 4 weeks," you'll get it done in 3 weeks, even if you have to cut corners. And so that sort of happened. So you had some poor construction techniques. But the most important thing is they were running a test. You'll hear people say it was an experiment. It wasn't an experiment. They had done it a few times. So with a nuclear reactor, the key is you need water. You have to have water going through the whole time to both cool it and then also to produce the steam. And so in that reactor,
So on that note,
yep.
is it essentially an extremely advanced steam-powered engine?
Yeah, effectively. But I always, when I taught the sixth graders, I had to keep it real simple. So I had to explain to them that everything, with the exception of solar, requires a fluid moving through a turbine. And everything except hydro, that fluid is steam. So we use gas, coal, oil to boil water to create steam to go through the turbine to generate power. Hydro, you don't have to create steam, you just have the flow of water. In a nuclear power plant, you're using the splitting of the atom to generate this immense amount of heat to produce the steam to turn the turbines. So one of the problems with this is that if they lose power from the grid, how do they keep the pumps running? It took 90 seconds for the diesel generators to come up to speed. And these pumps, there are 8 total per reactor. You typically would run 6 at a time, 3 on either side, and you have 2 in reserve. When those pumps are operating, they will empty an Olympic-sized swimming pool in about 3 minutes. And that just shows you how much water they're pumping. So what they were trying to figure out was, okay, let's say we lost power from the grid. We had to maintain those pumps for 90 seconds. How do we do that? So the idea was, well, we've got the reactor going. Why don't we switch the grid power to the pumps to the reactor power, to the turbines from the reactor? Okay, makes sense. And so they had run the experiment. They only had to have it for 90 seconds, and then they would have the diesel generators, and they'd be good to go. So they had run the experiment, I think it was, or the test 2 or 3 times, and it didn't work the first 2 or 3 times they had errors in calculation and how it worked, and so they were making adjustments and everything. And so this was the third or fourth time they were to do this. And unfortunately, so there's a couple things that then happened. One was that um, they disabled all the safety features of the system. So because they were going to go in, and that reactor design also becomes very unstable at low power settings because it's so big. In a U.S. reactor, it's relatively small, and the power, the discrepancies or the deltas in the amount of power within a nuclear reactor are very minimal changes in a U.S. reactor. This thing is so big that if you're moving control rods up and down at different rates, you can have different power levels at different parts of the reactor. And it took the Scala computer 15 minutes to do a run. So you were always 15 minutes behind. But like any other engineer, they sort of knew over time, well, if I adjust this and adjust that, it should get me the right parameter. Then 15 minutes later, the Scala tells me, yes, I'm correct. So they disable a lot of safety features. One of the most important ones they disabled, unfortunately, was they have large cooling tanks of water, and they chained the valve so no one could accidentally open one up for fear that we had this giant hot tub of water. If you've ever taken I guess china or a glass and filled it with hot water, then cooled it real quick, it'll
Correct.
crack.
Yeah.
Afraid of the reactor doing that, so they chained that.
Ironically, it cracked anyway. But.
Yeah, exactly. And then they decided to start the experiment about 1:00 in the afternoon. Or the test. I keep saying this here.
Really quickly, before we get into it, the safety features I want to cover, I'll forget everything. If they had not disabled the safety features, could the experiment still have worked? Was it necessary?
Theoretically, still would have worked. It wasn't necessary. And that's sort of that whole central planning. It went all the way up to what the equivalent of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and nobody wanted to say no. And so everybody just signed off on it. In reality, that whole plan, they should have said, no, you can't do this. That goes outside the safety parameters. You have to change this part of doing the test.
And the reason,
but no one signed off on it.
Okay, and the reason why I'm asking this is because, there is a giant fear of nuclear power. But nuclear power is also shown to be incredibly effective. So I want to cover, in terms of how safe, how risky, et cetera, it is. Obviously, human beings make everything risky. And that's what you're potentially describing. So go on and continue.
Yep. And there's a great documentary called Pandora's Box, if anybody wants to learn about nuclear power. They actually take like 5 anti-nuclear people and go through their journey of how they became more pro-nuclear. And one of the things they stayed in there is the amount of uranium that fits on your thumbnail is enough to provide you power for your entire life, for everything you need. That's how dense nuclear power is. Wow. And fortunately, modern systems are much, much safer. They're inherently safe, but we can talk about that in a second.
Definitely.
So in this one, they should not have signed off on all these things, and they did. So then they started the experiment about 1:00 in the afternoon. They had to bring the reactor down to about 200 megawatts from its peak of 1,000 megawatts. That's how they wanted to do the test. And as they started to reduce the power, and a nuclear power plant's not like a gas or coal fire power plant or oil where you just like turn a knob and it slows down. You put your foot on the gas or your car goes fast, you let go, it slows down. Nuclear doesn't work that way, especially one this big. They really had to put in control rods and absorbers and sort of balance that reactor to get it to that point, because the test was if we were in the process, because they were actually getting ready to shut down the reactor anyhow the next day for maintenance that they had to do, where they had to shut down the whole reactor. And so that was another thing that led into this. They're like, well, we won't have another chance for several months to try this again, so we're going to go through with this. So they started lowering the power. And so real quick, Chernobyl had 4 reactors at the time, 2 more under construction, and the eventual plan was to have 12 reactors there. And it was the first nuclear power plant in Ukraine, the SSR, and it was providing power. So they got a call from the central grid saying, hey, we need power. Don't lower your thing anymore. So they started to bring the reactor back up to, I think, 50 or 60% power. And it wasn't until about 11:00 at night that they got the go-ahead to continue with the test. Well, what happens at midnight? Shift change. And so you have a whole new set of people coming in to operate the reactor who were familiar with the test, but weren't necessarily the ones who had gone through all the training and everything else. And so they started to bring the reactor down. So one of the side effects of when you split an atom, uranium, you get you get 3, typically 2 to 3 neutrons, which then continue on the splitting of the atom. But you also get byproducts, and one of them is xenon and krypton, or krypton and something else, and then they half-life and become xenon, and then iodine. And you'll hear the term iodine poisoning or xenon poisoning. So what happened is, as they slowed the reactor down, these actinides built up inside the reactor. And normally at high power, they eventually get burned off. They get reabsorbed, and you go through this whole process. But they didn't. And so the reactor became very unstable. And as they were trying to bring the power back up, they again violated safety protocols. There are a minimum of 26 control rods need to be in the reactor at all times. And they were trying to get that reactor up. It like dove down to 1%, and it scared them. And they tried to bring it back up to about 7 or 8%. And they started pulling control rods out. So at the time of the accident, there were only 8 rods left in the system, where they were supposed to have a minimum of 26. And so
Did that
right
make
at
it
about
worse or better?
worse, because the reactor became runaway. So what happened then, right at, it's 123:44 to 46 seconds. The reactor, as they started pulling all these rods out. And so I should also say this is also what's called a graphite moderated reactor. So US reactors, we use water as the moderator. So in nuclear power, you have to moderate. So if I use this example, if you take those, we called them, super balls when we were little kids, those little rubber balls.
Mhm.
If I took a handful of those and threw them on the ground really quick, they go all over the place and they never run into one another.
Hmm.
But if I just drop them and they just bounce, the likelihood of some of them running into one another increases. Well, that's sort of the same thing in a reactor. You have prompt neutrons. When you split an atom, you get 2 to 3 neutrons coming out. And they're moving really, really fast. And the likelihood of them hitting another uranium atom and splitting that goes down because they're moving so fast. So in the US, we use water to slow it down. Well, in the US, if the water were to boil off and become steam, the neutrons leave the
Escape,
system.
sort
And
of.
so you wind up having what's called a negative void coefficient. So the reactor slows down. That's one of the reasons modern reactors in the US are relatively inherently safe, because if the water boiled off, the reactor is just going to slow down. Now, there's other issues with the water boiling off. They used graphite in their reactors. And so the control rods, because the control rods come down from the top and then go out through the bottom of the reactor vessel. So at the bottom of the control rod, they had about 1 meter, 3 feet of graphite. So what happened is they had all the control rods up, and then the reactor power spiked, shot up. And so right at 123:44 to 46 is what the time. No one's 100% sure whether a human being hit this, what's called the scram button, or the AZ5, it's just the Russian translation, or if it automatically shut down. But effectively what happened is they hit that button, and it normally takes about 20 seconds for the rods because they're mechanical. They're not now the updated design. They're now gravity fed, but it took 20 seconds for them to go in. Well, what happened is the reactor gotten so hot that the chambers where those rods went down in had warped. So when the rod went in, the control rod went in, just the first couple meters of it went in and instituted or implemented additional moderation in the system. So the water boiled off in the reactor, steam. So things were moving faster, which exposed it to more graphite. You had the rods go in, which moderated even further, which basically it went from 200 to 300 megawatts of electrical power to about 3 gigawatts, 10 times. And so the first explosion you had was really a steam explosion. So you had basically, because the reactor, which I always found interesting, it's this giant 45 feet by, I think it's 20 or 30 feet high, is hermetically sealed. So there's no air in it. And all this water just basically flash boiled off, and it was like a boiler exploding and blew up. And then almost instantaneously after that, one of the byproducts, so the fuel rods are covered with what's called zircolite. And one of the interesting things about that, when that's in high temperature presence of water, it does electrolysis and breaks water into oxygen and hydrogen. So all of a sudden
Oh,
we had
air
all
to
this
feed the fire.
Yep. And then you had a secondary explosion that blew up the building. And I mean, it was powerful enough that it took what's known as you'll hear the term Elena. It was the E1, I believe is what it's called. It's the upper biological shield. So it's all these little, each block that covers each control rod and fuel assembly weighs about 800 pounds. They're about 10 inches by 10 inches by, I think, about 2 feet. and then there's concrete over top of that. So this was 20 or 30 ton concrete disc and metal, and it just blew it up and flipped it on its side when the explosion happened, and then just radiation everywhere.
Okay, now watch your, especially you had mentioned that it threw more radiation or particles or whatever in the sky than Hiroshima. You gave a certain
So
amount.
yeah, and I forget. It's been a while since I've had to use that statistic. But in general, nuclear bombs, remember, the core of a nuclear bomb is about this big. It's not very big. And the idea is I want all that energy to be released instantaneously, and so the amount of radiation that's produced is not that great. I mean, it's high in that general vicinity. It's the heat and the blast that kills in a nuclear bomb, not necessarily radiation, although you do have radiological effects, primarily because it's plutonium. And if you inhale plutonium fibers, the elements
But Hiroshima wasn't
bring down.
plutonium, right? That was
No,
uranium.
it was uranium, yeah, enriched
Okay,
uranium.
okay.
Chernobyl, you basically had your giant fuel box and you just threw it everywhere. It was 50 or 150 times the amount of radioactive material and just threw it out. And that's why people always ask about Fukushima. What about Fukushima? Well, Fukushima wasn't an explosion. Yes, there was an explosion, but it's funny because it's similar to the secondary explosion. There's a metal building that covered, I think they're Westinghouse reactors. And of course, they're venting off, trying to manage the reactors at the time, and they were venting off the hydrogen and oxygen, and it was inside the metal building that covered the reactor, and that's what actually exploded. So people, there's an explosion here at Fukushima. Well, it wasn't really an explosion of the reactor; it was an explosion of the building. So you didn't have a lot of nuclear elements released or radioactive elements there. The radioactivity was because they had to release it from the reactor to keep the reactor from exploding. But at Chernobyl, it just went everywhere. So, and there's still 50 tons. There's enough plutonium inside of that reactor, inside what's called the new safe confinement or the original sarcophagus, to kill everybody on the Earth 2 or 3 times over.
Oh, that's all.
Yeah.
Okay, so I was asking that because it's just interesting. If it emitted that much more effect, is it because of design or something different? Because obviously Hiroshima killed a whole lot more people.
Yeah, but it killed people because of that immense explosion and that blast wave.
Okay.
Chernobyl wasn't a nuclear explosion.
Okay.
It was a steam explosion. It just happened to throw radioactive material everywhere. And in fact, that the only reason that the West even found out about it is that in Sweden, a couple power plants, I think it was about a day and a half later, their alarms started going off, and they thought they had a leak. And they're checking. They couldn't find a leak, and then they talked to plants in Norway and Finland and started making their way across Europe, and then eventually made it to Moscow. And they said, "Oh yeah, we had a small accident at Chernobyl, but it's all under control." The interesting fact is, I don't know if you remember during the Gulf Wars, Hans Blick, his name, he worked for the NAEA, basically the Nuclear Regulatory Commission of the United Nations.
Weapons
he was
inspector?
the one inspector, correct?
Okay.
He was the first Westerner to arrive in Chernobyl.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, and they came in 2 or 3 days afterwards. And most people don't realize that a large bulk of the material landed in Belarus, because the reactor is about 15 kilometers, 7.5 miles from the Belarusian border. So a lot of that radioactive material and cloud wound up landing in Belarus. And the funny thing,
trade winds or something.
Yeah, and I've been to Fukushima, and I got to talk to Naoto Kan, the former prime minister of Japan, during that accident, and we were chatting. And the interesting sort of history is that the Japanese were the first to send support to Belarus. And then when Fukushima happened, the Belarusians were the first to send support to the Japanese, because they have learned so much. I always say if there's any, I don't know how you say something good came of this accident, but if you can say something positive came of the accident, we've learned more about high dose radiation, biological systems impact with high dose radiation, and how to manage and clean up. I'll use that term loosely.
Contain
radioactive,
maybe?
Yeah, because you can use Prussian blue will absorb the radioactive actinides and will hold on to them. In fact, that's in Chernobyl, the big issue is that they had to scrape the top layers of dirt. They washed all the buildings off and then tried to scrape. In Japan, they immediately went and started scraping the first 10 centimeters of earth off of everything,
Uh,
washed the buildings. And now there are giant, 2-ton sacks in these giant fields in near Fukushima, in the various prefectures of material, and they're slowly processing them through a whole system that, sort of pulls that material out of the soil.
okay, no, that's fascinating. Now, circling back, I wanted to ask you, what was the difference between 3 Mile Island
Mhm.
and Chernobyl? I honestly don't know anything other than
Right.
3 Mile Island was this horrible, thing, and I didn't
Yeah.
know much about Chernobyl.
Yeah, so 3 Mile yeah, I always grew up thinking 3 Mile Island was worse, we really didn't study it much. 86 is when it happened. I was in a sophomore in high school when it happened.
The Chernobyl was
When
86. Yeah.
Chernobyl, yeah. I was 3rd grade, Mrs. Murray's class when it happened. It's funny because 'cause I'm sitting in class and, "Will Bobby Smith please come to the front office? Will Judy Sue please come to the front office?" All these people are leaving. I'm like, "What's going on?" And then my parents, I knew, were going. They were basically supposed to leave that day for vacation. They wound up getting us, 11, 12 o'clock in the morning, whenever it was, and took us down to my grandparents in Maryland, which was downwind of the reactor complex. So should it have gone south, that would have been an issue. But first and foremost is that um, 3 Mile Island never exploded. They sort of were worried about a meltdown. The issue is really one of the gauges that they needed to keep an eye on was below eye level, and so they couldn't see it clearly. And actually, one of the redesigns was to move that gauge up. And so they wind up getting overpressure, overheat, all this stuff in the reactor, and you'll hear them that they were releasing radioactive material. And so if you look at even at Chernobyl, we always see the giant cooling towers, and everybody always goes, "Oh, it's a nuclear power plant." The reality is coal-fired power plants, I think even gas-fired, they all will have cooling towers because I've got to take the water and condense it. So that cooling tower is a giant radiator. But there are also stacks on top of a nuclear reactor because they will vent certain materials they can vent out. And the half life is so quick that by the time it reaches the top of the stack, it's no longer
Hmm.
radioactive, that particular thing. And so, unfortunately, at 3 Mile Island, they had to let a lot more out. The hydrogen and oxygen, they were afraid they were building this hydrogen bubble. Remember, you get that electrolysis. And they did have a meltdown. And of course, everybody was going, meltdown is a horrible thing. You hear the China syndrome. Well, it's going to melt down and go all the way through the core of the earth
Hmm.
to China. Not necessarily, but what happens is all that fuel melts together and you can't use the reactor anymore. And
Hmm.
that's effectively what happened. We did find out, I think it was in 2021 or 22, they released some KGB documents, and it turns out there was a partial meltdown in reactor 1 at Chernobyl in
Oh,
81 or 82 prior to the accident. So,
interesting.
but that's the difference. There was no explosion. It could have been bad, but they were able to regulate it and prevent the worst from happening.
Hmm.
Now, did it affect the environment? I don't know. That's one of the problems with the radiation and exposure. There are two ways of sort of measuring it. You'll hear the term stoichiometric and deterministic. Uh, Deterministic is you and I both get hit with a sievert or 2 sieverts, which is a very high amount
Hmm.
of radiation. We're going to react pretty much the same way. We're going to get cancer. We're going to get sick. We're going to lose our hair, whatever. At a certain levels below that, it becomes stoichiometric, which just means random. Now, my father, as I mentioned, he's a ears, nose, and throat surgeon, and he, in his early days of practicing in the 70s or whatever, 80s, he would do maybe a couple parotid tumors a year, and by the time he was finishing practice in I guess the 90s before he retired,
Hmm.
mid 90s, he was doing 1 or 2 a month. Now, is that because of 3 Mile Island, or is that because of other
Hmm.
environmental factors that are happening? And that's sort of the same thing with Chernobyl. Is you'll hear the WHO and the UN initially, and those who are all very anti-nuclear, hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people died.
Hmm.
No,
I want to talk about that for sure
yeah,
because
yep,
when I heard about what you do, I've been haunted by a presentation by Michael Crichton that he put on in, I think, 2005 when he was doing research for his book, State of Fear, that he was exploring an environmental disaster and, into a plot of a thriller. He thought, well, there could be nothing greater than Chernobyl. That was the worst of the worst of the worst. And when he did this, he came to find out that the actual death tolls were not only much smaller than expected, but like a rounding error of what was expected. They were minuscule. I think he said there was 50 some odd people who perished within like the first couple days
Yeah.
or whatever.
Yeah. So the official count that they recorded is 29 people died directly as a result. They were first responders, firefighters, and Valery Kademchuk died inside the reactor. He was in the uh, uh, pump room, and the blast destroyed the pumps, and so he's forever entombed. Now, so okay, how many people died after that? So that's where the UN started trying to, oh, it's hundreds of thousands, millions. In the reality, it's probably anywhere from 5 to 20,000 people. Again, because you
Which
get
is
into that
still bad.
stoichiometric, yeah, over a period of time. And I worked with a Dr. Baranoff, and I hope I pronounce his last name correctly, at the UN. He's an ears, nose, and throat, runs the Children of Chernobyl, or Chernobyl Children's Fund here in the States. And he was basically going, and they were doing thyroid checks, because that's one of the things you always hear people talk about. Oh, you got to take iodine pills. Got to take iodine. The civil defense got to have iodine pills in case of a nuclear attack. The reality is that only helps children and pregnant women, and part of it is because your thyroid takes up sodium, and you have uh, um, radioactive material that can get into that, and you wind up absorbing it into your pituitary, or in your thyroid. And what the sodium iodine does is basically fills up your thyroid, so that the radioactive material, won't fill it up. But it only works for children and for pregnant women. Men don't. The uptake into your thyroid is very small. So anyhow, so he was doing all these tests, and they found lots and lots of thyroid cancer. And he made this great statement. He said, "Look, I can't tell you it's because of Chernobyl that we're seeing an increase, but I also can't tell you it's not because of Chernobyl. And anybody on either side that tells you definitively it is or isn't is no longer a scientist, because they've stopped looking." And I do the same thing with the climate change and all these other things. I always say that the role of science is not to answer the questions. The role of science is to question the answers. And you should always be questioning what you see. And so I thought that was a wonderful statement. Did it have an impact? Oh, most definitely, I'm sure. Is it impacting children today? I don't know it's necessarily Chernobyl, but there's so many other things. So let's take a step back and talk about radiation in general. You're exposed to radiation all the time. Background radiation, you get an x-ray at the dentist, all those kind of things. In fact, you're getting anywhere from, and I use the SI measurements. We use rads and REMs here in the States, but I learned doing all this, so I'm going to use sieverts. So microsieverts, which is the smallest. Background radiation right now is about 0.3 microsieverts. Colorado, it's probably about 0.5 to 0.6. Well, why is that? One, granite. There's a lot of granite in Colorado. Granite has radiation. You're also higher up in elevation, so you have less atmosphere, so you're getting exposed to gamma rays. And I always use this because people always ask me, "Hey, do you have any side effects? Do you have any?" Of course, I have a really off-color joke. I won't do a podcast, but I'll tell you offline.
Oh,
But
geez.
in general, if I get an ingrown toenail, people are like, "Oh, it's because you went to Chernobyl."
Mhm.
But what I do is I have a fortunate enough that Marion Technologies, which is the world's leader of manufacturer of radiological testing and monitoring equipment, happens to be based here in Atlanta, and so I met them early on in doing this, and they have a dosimeter. So you hear the term Geiger counter or dosimeter, or as my European friends call it, a dosimeter, but dosimeter and Geiger counter. Geiger counter is going to measure radiation as a time value. It's how many X, in this case, millisieverts per hour. That means if something is emanating 1 millisievert per hour, you stand next to it for an hour, you will have absorbed 1 millisievert.
Mm.
So the Geiger counter is measuring how much is coming off of a device or off of an element. A dosimeter is measuring your absorption. So that's
Okay.
like if you go
Cause
to, if you
and
see,
effect, almost.
a little bit, yeah, yeah. And so if you go to a dentist's office or somebody who works in radio, they'll have the little radioactive radio badge, they call them, and they check that just to make sure they're not getting exposed. So I have my dosimeter. So I do this experiment where as soon as I go through security at the airport,
Mhm.
because if it goes through the X-ray machine, I can tell you that is 2 millisieverts of radiation in the X-ray machine at the airport, because I've run my dosimeter through it and checked to see what it was, because I'm a
Now,
nerd
hold on.
engineer.
While
Yeah.
we're on it, what about the naked body scanners, as I like to call them, versus
Yeah,
the
those are millimeter waves, so that does not use ionizing. So
okay.
that's the other thing. So there's radiation is basically just the transmission of energy through matter, and in general, that matter is air. So you have infrared radiation. So you're outside, the sun's shining on you. You have ultraviolet radiation. Then you have and again, the phone, and that's radiation. That doesn't affect you as much as ionizing radiation. And ionizing radiation is where it's basically the um, electrons leaving, or the protons leaving an element as it breaks down, half-lifing, and that's what is the energy. And so, to give an example I use for the little kids at the sixth grade class, you rub your feet on the ground and you shock somebody. That hurts. Ionizing radiation has anywhere from 10 to 100 times that amount of energy.
Mm.
And then that ionizing radiation, the alpha, and so you have alpha, beta, and gamma. Alpha pretty much gets stopped in midair. It can't really travel through air. It won't go through your skin.
Mm.
Beta radiation can pretty much be stopped by a t-shirt. It's gamma that has the high, it's 10, I think it's 10,000 electron volts, maybe be higher than that if I remember correctly. And so that'll penetrate several feet of concrete or a couple inches of lead. That's why they put a lead apron on you. And so do the scanner. Once I've gone through the X-ray machine, I reset it, and then I measure it from the time I get on the airplane, fly to Europe, and I land, and I write that down. Then I reset it. I measure all the time I'm on the ground in Chernobyl, write that down, reset it, do the same thing on my trip back, go through security, reset it, get on the airplane. All but 2 trips, I received more radiation on the airplane than I did on the ground in Chernobyl.
I was wondering. Okay, but that answers a lot of questions for me, because I was in the Army way back in the day, and we had MOP 4 equipment. Okay, and I had NBC training, nuclear, biological, chemical training, and those stupid ass outfits are very uncomfortable. It's charcoal with rubber gloves, rubber boots, gas mask, all of that. And I'm sitting there watching you walking around the facility on video. Now, obviously, when you were inside the control room, you were fully masked and in a suit. But I noticed a couple things, like throughout other parts of the facility. Yeah, you were wearing kind of an outfit, but your face, other than like a BS mask, not even an N95 mask, it was just a straight out allergy mask, if you will.
Yeah, and all of that is really for radioactive dust mitigation.
Mm.
It's less for protection. Yes, there's some protection, but it is, I don't want to take, if there were radioactive material, dust out of the facility. That's really what it's for. And inside the reactor, other than, say, the control room number 4, obviously, where the accident happened, or inside the new safe confinement, the radiation levels are, outside are actually higher than inside the building.
Interesting. So the reason why I'm bringing this up is because I was thinking that if I was going to be going there, I'd be wearing MOP 4 and then jumping out and taking a Silkwood shower, if you know what I'm talking about.
Yes. So the MOP 4 suit really does not protect you at all against radiation.
Oh, great.
Yeah. What it does, because again, it's gamma's the one you're worried about, and that's what's released in a nuclear bomb. And you need, several feet of concrete or lead. What you're really protecting against is alpha and beta, that reduction, which is around, and more importantly, keeping it out of your lungs. Because what happens is that high energy electron basically is roughly the same size as your DNA,
Mm-hmm.
and so it collides with the DNA in your cell and destroys it. And that's what cancer comes from, effectively. This is a real simplistic way of explaining it, but it makes sense to people, is that I'm basically being hit by these gamma rays, or, photons, depending on how you want to call it. And it's damaging the chromosomes. And then those chromosomes mutate, and that's how I get cancer. And that's really what happens with radiation. And it's probably one of the worst ways to die, because you effectively feel like you've got the flu. You feel really achy and bad, and then you'll start to feel okay for a day. And then it goes downhill. And what's happening is your body is basically disintegrating from the inside out. In fact, they tell a story. There's one of the engineers when the reactor exploded. There's 2 concrete rooms adjacent to the reactor hall, and there are people in there. And the one guy got knocked over, so his buddy went in and grabbed him, did a fireman's carry, and carried him down, 2 or 3 stories down to where the control rooms were, and took him off. And when he did that, he had a sunburn across his back from where the guy was because he was radioactive. In fact, the several of the
Did he make
firefighters,
it?
when they were no,
Okay.
no. Several of the firefighters, they got moved to, I think it's hospital number 5. Everything's numbered. So hospital 126 is in Pripyat. Hospital 5, I think, is the one in Moscow, specialized in radiation. And they were so radioactive, had absorbed so much, and then in them themselves, because you don't become radioactive if you touch something that's radioactive. It winds up being on the surface. But if you're hit by neutrons, that effectively affects the molecular, we're made up of protons and neutrons, and typically have the same number of protons, same number of neutrons. If you have more protons, typically you lose those, and that's ionizing radiation in a simplistic model. They were so radioactive that they had to put them in lead-lined coffins.
Wow.
So that they would not release radiation. And then just outside of Pripyat, there's an area called Barakivka. They call it radiological vehicle graveyard, where they have 28 pits that they dug down so many meters, and they lined it with clay, and then lined it with plastic, and then had to put all the material that they pulled from all of the buildings, and then all of the stuff they used to clean up all of the buildings in Pripyat. They buried all of them. And my first trip, there were 3 pits still available that had not been filled. They didn't look like what the guy had described to me when I went and visited the control room there. They didn't look that safe. The last time I went to Barakivka, those last 2 pits were filled in. So they've been pulling stuff out of the old reactor, working on stuff with new sarcophagus, and then there is the Vector compound, which is a mid-level long-term or mid-level mid-term storage that's there as well. Because the whole idea now is, with this new safe confinement, they're going to slowly decommission and disassemble that whole complex, and they need to put it somewhere. So they built a whole what's called a dry cask storage. That's how we store radioactive waste in the U.S. It's inside steel, inside lead, then eventually inside a big concrete drum that can be hit by a train. It'll destroy the train, but that won't leak. So they built that in order to start.
Do you see Pripyat ever
radioactive.
coming back?
No. It'll be roughly 600 years before all of the cesium and other element half-lives out to a point that it's no longer really dangerous. Although, like I said, there are people who moved back, what they call resettlers or Zamoysias, who moved back several days after the accident and lived there. In fact, Babushka, there's Grandpa Sava and his wife moved back within the 5-kilometer zone. They're the only ones who lived at the 5-kilometer zone, and he passed away in 2015. I was able to do his.
How old was he?
He was in his 80s.
That's
and
not that daunting.
And I did an interview of his last interview in 2015. So I have that interview, which I'm just thankful that I have. And he talks about when Gorbachev came to visit him, and the 2 boxers, their names escape me right now. One was the mayor of Moscow, Kolensky brothers or something like that. It'll come to me. Yeah, they came to visit. And he was saying how they were afraid and all this kind of stuff. Very, very interesting thing. And then Baba Hana, one of the babushkas, who I visited in 2010 the first time. She was such a sweet lady. I mean, they have nothing or next to nothing, and they live subsistence farming. And she lives by herself in a little village with like 6 or 10 other older ladies, all in their 70s. She had her sister, who was mentally challenged, lived with her. And I think there was only one man left in the village. And we got there, and she was so sweet. She brought food out for us and gherkins and this moonshine that she made homemade. It was the strongest stuff I've ever had in my entire life.
It was radioactive. No.
yeah. Doing shots with it. Well, Baba Hana just passed away like 2 months ago or a month and a half ago in her late 80s. So, this level of radiation and the impact, it's again, it becomes very what's called stoichiometric at that point. It's really, unless you're up close and personal and being bombarded
in that exact moment or whatever. Okay, the reason why I asked is because I even just this morning, just for giggles, and you can't depend on ChatGPT for being absolutely factual, but for quick just questions, it's great. And I was saying, okay, what are the biggest factors that can cause cancer in a human being? And of course, exposure to radiation, direct, it says radiation exposure, high dose, and overall cancer, of course. But then, there were many other factors. So I always like to go, well, can you put in order of what is the most risk for cancer? Where do you think it fell in the top? I came up with like 13 results.
Yeah, I'd say probably radiation exposure in general is probably somewhere in the top 10, maybe. I
It
don't think
is.
it quite made top five.
It did in this, but it is a
Okay.
question.
Yeah.
But to give you an idea, the number one is smoking.
Yeah.
Number two, asbestos. And number three, BRCA1 and BRCA2 mutations of breast cancer, then radiation.
Yeah.
But
Sure.
even that was questionable, and because it came up twice, it came up as thyroid cancer, potentially for Chernobyl. But that's interesting because overall, it says you have a 20 to 30% increased risk for those exposed to high doses of ionizing radiation. And that matched secondhand smoke.
Yeah.
20 to
So
30% higher risk. So, and again, I'm
so
not
here's
trying to downplay it, but I do kind
no.
of wonder.
Yep, yep. No, exactly. So here's an interesting story. So when I was doing all this research, I happened to have been living in Denver, Colorado at the time for my job, and I was trying to really get to the root of how the Chernobyl reactor worked. And so it just happened that the Colorado School of Mines has a nuclear power program there. So I went and reached out there and got in touch with a professor whose specialty was reactor failure and design analysis. So I went and had dinner with him and asked him a million questions. And one of the questions I have, so if you look at I think it's believe it or not, it's not the FDA that sets the radiation exposure in the US, it's the Department of Energy that sets it. And yeah, and so it says the average exposure for a human being in the US should not exceed total of 20 millisieverts in a year. And it really should be closer to like 3 to 5 millisieverts. Okay. But if you work in nuclear power or nuclear medicine, you're allowed up to 50 millisieverts. I'm like, so I asked him, like, do they have special powers? Do they get immune to it? He says, no, it's all about money. I said, what do you mean? He goes, okay. So there's an average salary for everybody in the United States. This is what the average person makes. And the likelihood of you getting cancer below 20 millisieverts is like 1.2% or something really minimal. But between 20 and 50 millisieverts, the increase is only 1% or 2. But if you work in nuclear power, your salary is going to be 2 to 3 times greater, if not more, than the average salary in
Well,
the US. And
1%
so,
versus 1%, that's
yeah,
200% technically.
yeah, well, exactly. But it's so minuscule. So that's how they came up with the measurement. Which I
Wow.
was
And
like,
this stands
okay,
out to me because during the special, you had mentioned that people in the area had a 10 to 20% more likelihood. And I heard the 10 and I was waiting for times, but no, it was percent. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. And that's what started me down this rabbit hole saying, well, what's smoking? What are all these other things? How serious is it? And you haven't helped the case in the sense that you mentioned that you're getting more on your travels to get to Chernobyl on planes, thus implying, or I'm inferring, that a traveling salesperson who is in the air and getting millions of miles is at greater risk than you who hangs out at a nuclear disaster site.
exactly. As well as astronauts. Astronauts even have worse because you have no atmosphere protecting you. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, before we started, I do a lot of work with Red Digital Cinema, and they send a bunch of their Red cameras up onto the International Space Station. They have to replace them every so often because the sensors get hit with gamma rays and burns out the pixels on the sensor. And you can only do so much with what's called masking of those burned out pixels. But they get a lot of radiation up there. But you don't hear. Look at Buzz Aldrin. Was he 80 something? Didn't die of cancer. So it's really about the dose itself and how much you get in a short period of time or how much you get over a long period of time that affects you. And like I said, if there's anything you say beneficial that came out of the accident is that we now have a much better understanding to some extent of how bodies react to cancer or to radiation and how it impacts cancer. And cancer is still relatively, I know there'll be some argument about this, it's still relatively a disease of people in older in life. Now we got to remember people, used to be 50, 60 years old was the max you lived. We're now living into our 80s. And so that's where we're starting to see it. So is it because of environmental factors? Is it because we're living longer? Yeah, food, all these things have impacts. You just can't point to one specific thing that says that's the cause.
One question that, and you probably would know this because I think it's a factor too. Like, do you somehow filter out radiation or get rid of effects over time? Like if you get an exposure, does it clear your system over time?
Yeah, you'll eventually secrete it or expel it through your bodily fluids, that kind of stuff. If you're really, I mean, because there are tests that you have a PET scan,
Hmm.
you're injected with a radioactive dye, and eventually your body expels it. The funny thing is, we all emit a certain level of radiation. That's one of the things. If you sleep next to your wife or your husband, your significant other, they're irradiating you. Now
Ooh.
it's very, very small. As well as bananas are radioactive, potassium iodine.
Mm.
Now the reality is you would have to eat like 10,000 bananas before you would ingest enough at any one time to have the effects of radiation. You're going to have greater effects from an overdose of potassium in your
Probably,
system
yes.
before the radiation. But lots of things are radioactive out there. Radon is the one we hear most about in houses because it comes up from the soil. And the problem with radon, like anything else, it's a gas. And it's the breathing it in. Because remember, when you
Mm.
breathe it in, that's one of the reasons you also wear a dust mask in a lot of places. And you'll see there are certain areas in my video where I wear a respirator because of the level of dust, because there's no real lining of your cells inside your throat and your lungs. And so that ionizing radiation, your skin is relatively thick and you can sort of stop the alpha and beta, which is typically what you'll find in a lot of that dust. But if you breathe that into your lungs, then you've got some issues, which is, again, why smoking is so impactful, because it's directly impacting the cells in your lung. You don't have a lot of, skin protecting you from that.
All right. Well, this is amazing. And I always like to close out interviews, and I'd love to have you back to talk about other things. Um, but I always like to ask us, what is the one question I should have asked you and I neglected to? Or as a variant, what is the one question you've been waiting for somebody to ask you after all your interviews? You're just like, why does nobody ask me this?
Yeah. Well, I'll take a side step around that and then I'll come back to it. So the one question that I get asked a lot that I always find is amazing is, what's Chernobyl? And that's how you usually can understand how old that individual is if they're not sure what it is. Because I remember once, yeah, I was in at an international broadcasters conference in the Netherlands back in 2015. I think I was preparing to go for a trip and I'm looking at some equipment, and the nice little, young girl working the booth and explaining stuff. I said, "Oh, this would be great. I'm going to Chernobyl." And she looks at me. She goes, "Oh, I've never been there." And I went, "The site of the world's worst nuclear accident? No, I haven't gone."
Probably not.
Yeah. Um, that's a good question. I've been asked so many questions. I think the one is, hmm, probably is, could it have been prevented?
Hmm.
I think is a question that no one's really ever asked me. I don't know a good answer. Could it have been? In theory, yes. I think that the combination of that centralized planning of the Communist Party, the Socialist Soviet republics, that top-down approach that I've got to do everything to impress the people above me because I want to be up there. Um, I don't know if it could have been. I think that if it could have been stopped anywhere, it would have been stopped by the equivalent of the Nuclear Regulatory Agency to say, "Hey, don't run the test this way." The other thing that most people don't know about the area, and for the longest time, I didn't know the answer until I sought it out. So, city of Pripyat, 50,000 people. It's about a mile and a half from the reactor. Was evacuated 2.5 days after the accident.
Hmm.
and they weren't really told what happened, what had happened. They were just said, "Oh yeah, we had a small issue at the power plant." Oh, they could see all the stuff and people walking around in mop suits or the equivalent of that,
My
and
lights
Geiger
aren't working.
counters. Yeah,
No power at the
um,
house.
and they. Oh, this other thing is the other three reactors continued to run or came back online in May or June, July, August timeframe, and finally November. The last reactor didn't shut down until 2000, December 15th of 2000, because they needed
You're
power.
still using it. Oh my God.
Yep, yep. So,
How about those
but anyhow, so
employees? I got a sidetrack.
yeah,
How about those
yeah,
employees who were there running those reactors? How are they doing?
yeah. They're doing fine. In fact, I've spoken to several of them. I spoke to somebody who came in. He worked in Reactor 4 and was coming in on the morning shift. And he's the one I chatted a lot with. So it's funny because so if you saw the HBO docudrama, you see the story about and you hear the story about these three, two engineers and an assistant. They volunteered to dive in below the reactor, sort of like a catacomb, and they were worried about they're calling it nuclear lava, but basically the nuclear fuel hitting the water that had been poured into the reactor and effectively having a nuclear explosion then. Because remember, I said water acts as a moderator. If that radiation hit it, would it have caused an explosion? And they dove in selflessly. The flashlight burned out. They had to feel their way around, and they turned off or they opened the valve, and they came out, and they all died like 3 to 5 days later. Well, that never happened. In fact, I had always thought that had happened. It's been written in several books, and I was in a small village just outside of the Chernobyl region, and talking to some people at a bar, and the one guy he said, I told the story, asked him about it. He goes, "Oh no, one of them just died like 2 years ago from a heart attack. Two of them are still alive. Would you like to meet them?" I said, "Sure." So I got to meet them. And then he explained to me on the side of you ever wonder, we called it the radioactive tank, but it's really a self-propelled gun that's like maybe a kilometer from the reactor. He goes, "You ever wonder why that's there?" I said, "Well, I just thought, it's military protecting." He goes, "No, they wanted to pump the water out. And so they brought the tank in, or they were self-propelling, to blow a hole in the side of the reactor complex so they could put their hoses in." So, okay, that makes sense to some extent. Of course, where I'm going with this is then I had met the person who worked at the reactor. And this person at the bar said the person that worked at the reactor wasn't a nuclear engineer. He was just some maintenance guy who was there. But I spoke to him. I saw his documentation. I've studied enough nuclear engineering to know that he knew his stuff, and he showed me his documents from the KGB that he actually had to sign that says he couldn't talk about it because he was part of the team that did the analysis and then what recommendations they had to change in order to make the reactor safe. So now I'm like, is that guy right? Is that guy right? And that's part of, I think, this whole process is that sort of that triangulation. It's just like they say at a traffic accident, you can have three eyewitnesses that all three tell a different story. And the idea is, what can you find amongst all three of them? And that's sort of what drives me in a lot of this stuff, is sort of trying to figure those out, which is a long way around to getting to the Jupiter factory, which is in Pripyat. Most things in the Soviet Union had dual use. So this was a factory for workers. So the people who lived in the city of Pripyat had a place to work. And they made alarm clocks and radios. Makes sense. So they made, well, we always assumed they made something else. And I've been in the labs in the building, and there's stuff in the basement that was not designed for alarm clocks and radios. And I finally met an individual when I was doing my TV show and got to interview her, and she worked there. And I asked her, what did they make? And she goes, "We made parts for intercontinental ballistic missiles."
Of course she did. Amazing.
Oh, yeah.
Amazing. Okay. So since we circle, I'm going to just ask one final question
Sure.
that popped in my head, and I think it'll sum everything up. You have visited the worst nuclear disaster sites in the world and have researched the worst that could go wrong. Are you a believer in nuclear power, or do you find it too dangerous for us to use?
So that's a question I have been asked, because a lot of people will think that I'm anti-nuclear. I'm not. I'm anti-stupid. And the reactors we have now in the States, what we're calling Gen 4 reactors, Gen 3 plus, they just built one or two of them just north of me in Georgia Power, in Augusta, Georgia. they're, I'll use the term inherently safe. Nothing is inherently safe, but they're designed in such a way that if they, in fact, I saw a story. Was it the Idaho National Falls Laboratories where they did a test with these new designs? This was, 20 years ago, and they had the entire press in there, and they basically demonstrated what happened at Chernobyl and what happened at 3 Mile Island, and you'd see the basically the ticker showing it going up and up and up, and all the press is sort of looking around at the engineers, and none of the engineers are flinching. And then all of a sudden, everything came down because the way they're designed now is they cannot run away. Now, I'm a big proponent of thorium salt reactors, which are so all reactors are under pressure. They're pressure water or pressure steam reactors, and that's one of the problems. So you get all this stuff under pressure that it can explode. In a thorium reactor, you're using thorium salt. And I always say, and we've had salt reactors since the 60s, and I always say it was sort of like beta VHS. Thorium was better, but more expensive. VHS, the traditional uranium-based reactors were easier. Also, as I mentioned, the side product or byproduct of the fission process is plutonium. It's easier to get plutonium out of a uranium-based reactor than out of a thorium-based reactor. But basically, in a thorium-based reactor, it's molten salt that's creating the heat, and it's doing it. You can use radioactive waste as its fuel because you're filtering through. That salt goes through a filtering process as it's flowing through. You can extract all of the gunk, for lack of a better term, that becomes long-term radioactive waste because it can't continue to absorb neutrons through the process. So the stuff they pull out has a half-life of maybe 300 years, which is still long, but compared to 10,000 years of our normal reactors. And most importantly, they can use what's called a electrically cooled salt plug. So in the reactor, they have a plug that's electrically cooled made out of salt. And if for some reason the reactor lost power, that plug would melt and all the thorium salt would drop into a retaining tank.
Oh, wow.
So I'm definitely pro. If we ever want to get to net zero in this world and run, I'm not a big fan of electric cars. Hybrids I like. There's a diesel hybrid that Toyota makes in Europe that gets 70 miles to the gallon. I'm like, why don't we have that here in the States? But if we want to have that electrical, we're not going to do it with solar. I mean, just as an example, the largest solar plant in the U.S., I want to say it's not quite a 1,000 megawatts, 800 megawatts, I think.
And how much land does that consume?
Huge. It's like 13 acres. Compared to the largest natural gas plant, which is 3.7 gigawatts and is 0.8 of an acre. So, I'm a firm believer of all the above, but we're not going to do it with solar. Even if solar, has a factor of 4 or 5 improvements, which you're not going to get. You really have to look at nuclear. We've got to make some better laws regarding reprocessing of fuel here. And also, if you take all the nuclear waste in the United States and put it together, right now it's stored next to every single reactor in dry cask, but if you took it all and put it in one place, it would only fill up a football field about 7 to 8 feet high for all the reactors. So in the U.S., there are a little over 6,500, or maybe it's not, maybe it's closer to 9,000. I think there's 9,000, if not mistaken. I have to go look at the numbers. Electrical generation facilities, what we call grid scale facilities in the U.S. There's only 94 reactors left operational right now. Those 94 reactors out of the 7,000 or 8,000 total generations produces 20% of our power. So if we double that to, say, 200 reactors, we would be producing 50% of our power without CO2. And of course, there's even a new technology that's come out of fusion work that may even allow us to do geothermal at some point in time, which I've been keeping an eye on, which is kind of interesting.
Oh, this is amazing.
Well, thank you for having me. Appreciate it. It's nice meeting you. I've watched your program. I listen to Barnes all the time and Viva, so I know you guys are all talk to one another. So it's an honor actually to be on the show. I appreciate it.